Words for Today collected in book form. Over to our speakers this evening, Roly Sussex and Kelly Higgins-Devine, I'd like to reiterate some of the information mentioned in the email you was sent earlier. You've all automatically been placed on mute and will remain so throughout the event. But I will unmute everybody at the very end of our event so that you can join me in thanking our speakers for tonight's discussion. Also, if you set your settings to speaker view, our guests will take up the screen space. So I'd recommend to all of you that you just take that moment to set your screens to speaker view. Roly is keen to answer your questions in the latter part of the event, so please start sending your questions through as you think of them using the chat box. If you haven't seen the chat box, it is located at the bottom of your screen. On mine, it's around the center. On some people's, it's further over to the left. So you can use that to send your questions through. And your questions will come to me, and I'll relay as many as we have time for in the Q&A period. I'd also like to mention that we have a special promotion for you, our event attendees, whereby if you use the code EVENT in the Avid Reader online checkout, then you'll receive 10% off all books ordered from our website. I'll be posting the link to purchase your copy of Word for Today shortly. So now I'd like to introduce you to Roly Sussex. Roly Sussex is Emeritus Professor of Applied Language Studies at the University of Queensland and has been broadcasting language segments on ABC Radio in Queensland every week for 23 years and also in South Australia for 20 years. Since his formal role at the University of Queensland finished in 2010, he has been actively involved not only in the written and electronic media, but also in supervising research at the university and in undertaking research projects, especially on pain and communication and intercultural communication. He's chaired the board of the State Library of Queensland and the Alliance Française of Brisbane, and is currently president of the English-speaking Union in Queensland. In conversation with Roly tonight is Kelly Higgins-Devine. Kelly Higgins-Devine is the host of Evenings on ABC Radio Brisbane. She started her ABC career in 1999 after spending a number of years in commercial radio. Kelly has worked across most facets of broadcasting, from reporting and news reading to presenting local radio programs. In 2007, Kelly was named ABC Local Radio Broadcaster of the Year. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Madonna Duffy, Publishing Director at University of Queensland Press, to introduce tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land that I'm speaking from tonight, which is also the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. And I'd like to pay my respects to all of their elders, past and present also. Thank you to Jennifer and to Avid Reader for hosting tonight's event. Even if we're all together on a screen rather than in person, I have seen Avid's event list for this month, and it is incredible how much they are continuing to do for authors and readers in a time when we all need the comfort of a good book more than ever before. So I know you will support them through these months. I've had the good fortune to be Roly Sussex's publisher for this witty and fascinating book, Word for Today, on language use and misuse. When Roly and I first discussed the idea of him turning his popular ABC segments into a book, I was amazed to discover that he had only previously published quite serious academic works on language. So I immediately set about addressing that situation by contracting a selection of our favourite words for today into a book, for all of those people out there, like us, who love words and wordplay. Some or many of you may have been avid fans of Roly's ABC segment, which came into being because of an idea sparked by Kelly Higgins-Devine. Thank you, Kelly.
Welcome.
If you have heard of Roly's radio segments, you will know that he is funny, perceptive and sharp, as well as being one of the country's foremost experts on the English language and many others besides. So it seemed like the most obvious thing to do to make a book of his fabulous bon mot for his existing fans and for those less fortunate than us in other states where his radio segment isn't syndicated. As you can imagine, Roly has been a delight to work with this past year. He has kept me, his editor Felicity, and his publicist Sally entertained and informed with lots of fun facts and devious language conundrums. We have loved working with you, Roly, and we hope we get the opportunity to go on more linguistic adventures with you in the future. So I would just like to say, here's to you and your word for today, and hand over to Roly and Kelly. Thank you.
Thanks, Madonna. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Roly and I have known each other for many, many years now. And I was just thinking, Roly, that interestingly enough, you and I communicated more via sign language actually when we were on air together than we did via words. But we'll get to that. Congratulations on this, by the way. I'm so glad that UQP has taken this up and put it together as a book, because it's so worthy and it's so interesting. And you managed to take things that can be difficult concepts, changing concepts, and explain them so that the everyday person sitting at home who doesn't have a degree in language can easily understand what's changed, what's evolved, and the words that we've lost that maybe we need to bring back. And we'll talk about a few of those in a minute. Firstly, I just want to ask, when was your first radio broadcast? Was it with the ABC?
No, it wasn't. It was in Paris when I was 8, and I won't tell you what year that was. We were in Paris because my dad was a professor of French. He had a year's leave and he visited UNESCO. And UNESCO was doing a program about rural schools around the world, and they'd heard about the School of the Air in Australia. And in those days, kids had to pedal like mad on a generator to make electricity so that they could talk to the teacher at some remote location. And so they had a script and they wanted to record this. So Dad was the teacher and I was the pupil, and we recorded that. I had a lot of fun. They gave me £5 and I took it to London and bought a bike. So, which in those days what we did. But ever since then, I've realized that radio is a very special medium. And unlike TV, where you've got to have some video of what's going on, radio allows you to develop ideas. And if you've got a really cluey person across the desk to work with, then there's a multi-level conversation gets going. And after a while, you and I knew each other's tone of voice very accurately. And I know I knew Kelly was thinking, we've had enough of this topic. Can't you move on a bit? Or maybe, whoops, we don't think we're going to go there.
Yeah, when things got a bit fruity, that was when you get the panic look.
Yeah, well, that's your business, not mine. But radio is one of the best mediums. And so in 2014, I think it was in June, with an extremely innocent expression on your face, you said one day, hey, I've had an idea. Wouldn't it be good if you wrote some little pieces and voiced them for radio, and we could play them so that people were kind of reminded about language from time to time? Mm. And I immediately had two thoughts. One was, gee, that's brilliant. And the second one was, I think this is going to be a lot of work. Mm. And I have just written number 673, and I record them with Jeff Kavanagh at the ABC. He's our promos editor, in blocks of about 10. And they are put to air in Queensland and I think in the Territory and sometimes in other places. I haven't a clue which one is broadcast. And people come up to me in the street and say, hey, that was a good one this morning. And I honestly don't know which was which. But what we did with the book was we pulled them all together and selecting some of what we thought were the better ones. We made a collection of people to join in what I love about language, because I was taught English at school in a way which made it feel like a pretty much a dead body. You know, you identified the bits and imitated them in what you wrote, and that was what was required to get a good mark. Whereas I could see around me that Australian English wasn't like that. It was fermenting and developing and going off like a Catherine wheel. And I went to live in New Zealand in 1956. And at that stage, the voices on ABC in particular were British. They did the news and current affairs, and they were very, very like the BBC. When I came back in 74, they were all Australian, and I'd missed the switch over. It was one of the great regrets of my life. But since then, I've been happily involved in radio in various places, particularly since 1997, when ABC Brisbane rang up. And they said, people are complaining about public English. Would you like to come and do a program? I thought, oh, gee, that'd be fun. And when I got to the studio, the phone lit up like a Christmas tree, and we've been going ever since.
It's been lighting up every week for 23 years, as I well know. Well, let's just talk about Australian English. How do you find the character of Australian English in comparison with others, with other forms of English, American English, British English?
When I was young, I think Australian English, we had a kind of two-level relationship with it. One was, this is ours and we speak it and we feel comfortable. And the other was, particularly with people from overseas, we felt a little bit unsure as to whether this really cut the mustard. And so Australians overseas often used to adopt a rather British sort of way of speaking. Now, the great change in my lifetime has been that we've grown out of that, and we're now very comfortable with the skin of Australian English. And it is known internationally as one of the most unpredictable, quirky, perky, colourful, creative Englishes anywhere. And we are relentlessly informal. We love being on first name terms with people, and we also love playing with language. And this was actually one of the things which prompted the book and the programs and the way in which we go about talking about language. Because I don't think language is a dead body. That happened to Latin and Greek and Sanskrit, and they're dead languages. English is anything but. And so I want to share with everybody else the fascination that I experience in exploring bits of language. I've been paid all my academic life to discover things, so now I want to share them. Radio does just that.
Roly, it's been interesting over the years having those phone calls come through, and one of the things that people can be very passionate about is the evolving use of language and how it's not like it was in my day. And it was interesting sitting across from you, and you would be explaining, well, this is what happens with language, that it's always changing and you should expect it to do so, that the way we were talking in 1956 is not the way we're going to be talking in 2020. Right. So what are some of the big changes that you've experienced in your time as a language professor?
Okay, first one I think is that the written language is no longer the gold standard. When I was at school, we were told to speak the way we wrote, and we were told to write the way the British wrote, which is all very well, but it didn't really suit us. So the second thing is that I think the spoken language has made an enormous impact on the way we write, and it's now much more informal. It runs better off the tongue. And you get things like can't and won't and shan't, which were not allowed in essays when I was at school and which are now quite standard. We even get words like bloody, which can be used on radio without too much bother. And we find all sorts of Australian English, you know, the things like Bundy and Rocky and Cab Sav and Merlot and Cardi and Jezza and, you know, all those other things. The diminutives, which are so much part of Australian English. I've got a database of 6,073 as of this morning. Wow. We are creative in a way which no one else can match.
Well, with the book itself, Word for Today, how did you go about taking the hundreds and hundreds of definitions that you had and condensing them into what I hope will just be the first of these books?
Oh, that was the pleasure of working with the University of Queensland Press, because Madonna and Felicity Dunning, my editor, were both incredibly good in judgment and very firm and guiding and helpful and understanding. And we went right through about the 1,400 pieces that I've written and picked out three big themes on etymology, which is where words come from, neologisms, which are new words, and then misuses, some really bad ones and some not terribly bad. And we grouped them into three chunks for the purposes of this book. And during, working through that, because when you and I were doing radio together, we basically followed what the listeners were after. And they could be asking about anything. Older listeners often regretted the fact that the English we spoke wasn't the way they'd learnt at school. Was it in fact true that you could have nowadays a preposition at the end of the sentence? And the answer is yes, not only we can, but we should, because that's the way English has always been. And the tradition in school that I was taught, no prepositions at the end of the sentence, was just plain wrong. It was a misunderstanding about what English was doing. Younger speakers often wanted to know, was the English they were using in texting, was that still okay? Or was it somehow inadmissible or bad or misshapen? And the answer is no. It's a different sort of English for a different sort of purpose with a different technology. And they were exploiting the possibilities of English in a way which hadn't been around in the time of Shakespeare, who had no mobile phone.
Really?
Well, if he did, he'd have been absolutely stunning.
Well, this is it. And should we expect language to be different on different media, on the internet, as to how you might talk in an app and how you might then have a conversation at a cafe?
I think so. I would be very sad if the lovely, long, beautiful, rich tradition of written English was somehow forgotten or overwritten or sidelined or made a sort of museum artifact, because this is part of what we are. And there are people around, on the ABC, there are speakers like, say, Geraldine Doog or Richard Feidler, who are magic examples of beautiful Australian English in practice. On the other hand, English is now the world language. It's spoken by perhaps 2 billion people in some way or another. And it's used for different purposes in different places. You can use it in the bazaar in Malaysia, and you can use it on a mobile phone, and you can use it on in emails and so on. And each time it's got a slightly different character. And English is the ultimate, I suppose, in one way, it's the ultimate mongrel, but it's also been extremely good at sucking up bits and pieces wherever it's been. And in fact, there have been studies of English which says, look, French has an academy, they try and keep the language pure, and they try and throw out everything that isn't, particularly Anglicisms. English has been like flypaper. Wherever it goes, it picks up stuff. It picks up amok in Malaysia, and it picks up tea in China, and it picks up, I don't know, kolkhoz and things like that in Russian. And it doesn't become any less English. It's just a great big, rich mess of words. It's the biggest language that's ever been by a long way.
Roly, let's talk about some of the explanations you've got in the book. Let's start with etymologies. And
yes.
One of my favourites, salt and salary.
Yeah. Sal, S-A-L, was the Latin word for salt. And the Roman legionaries were paid partly or possibly totally in salt. It was a valuable commodity in those days. And so your salary is your salt money. And if you're worth your salary or worth your salt, it goes back at least 2,000 years to Roman legionaries doing their things in the trenches. So that bits of Latin persist in modern English, and knowing where they are and being able to pull them out and examine them actually makes us understand how English works a lot better. Because 75% of the vocabulary of English is not basically from the Germanic roots of English at all, it's from elsewhere. So salt is part of our legacy to Latin, and there's lots of it.
What about snorkel?
Ah.
Great word, snorkel.
Schnarchen is the German word meaning to snore. But what actually happened with snorkel was that during the Second World War, the Germans invented a device for submarines. And if you're in a submarine and you go up to the surface, you make yourself vulnerable to attack. So you're much safer under the water. But if you're under the water, you need air for the engines and for the people. And so they invented a sort of thing which would float up to the top and would allow air to be brought down into the submarine. And apparently it made a disgusting snoring noise, which reverberated right through the boat. And it was called a schnorkel, which was like schnarchen in German. And it wasn't until about 10 years later that people realized that you could adapt this with a small mask and flippers, and you could go out on the barrier reef and use it to enjoy the pleasures of the reef and the fish. So snorkel, be thankful to the Germans and to wartime technology. It's made our life as naturalists a lot easier.
And another one that we use and probably don't know how it began, blue murder.
Well, the French.
Blue murder.
Yeah, and there are various blue things around in English. In French, they used to say sacré Dieu, which means holy God, but then in French and in English, until the middle of last century, it was thought extremely wrong to utter the name of God except in religious worship, prayers. So instead of saying sacré Dieu, they said sacré bleu. Bleu sounds a bit, it's a word for blue in French. It sounds a bit like Dieu. And we heard the blue bit and borrowed that bit into English. And so, screaming blue murder and so on, it's actually a borrowing from French, and it's a euphemism, which means a nice way of avoiding a sensitive word. In French, Dieu, meaning God, was a sensitive word. We borrowed the blue bit, and now we've got blue in all over the place, although some of it isn't always explained. Blue meaning in bad taste or a bit questionable, possibly comes from a Scottish dialect around 1820. That one is, like so much of English, lost in the peat and the mist of time.
Do you find it interesting when you hear something you haven't heard in a while? For example, yesterday, you and I were having a coffee and I mentioned being full up to pussy's bow. With mocha, basically, my favourite coffee. You went, I haven't heard that in ages. There's something delightful, isn't there, about hearing something that you may have heard as a child or in your teen years, and people don't say it anymore.
Yeah, but for the younger generation, these things are virtually unknown. My grandma used to say that, and she was born in 1876. And she lived to 105 and she said to me once, dear, I can remember before we got the word great from America. And now that's something, because if you actually listen to the football broadcast, that was a great try.
Yeah.
Great is all over the place. So Don Burke is the only person who said hooroo for the last few years, unless you go out into country Queensland. It's a great pity that a lot of language is moving towards the edge and then getting forgotten. But I suppose it's the way language goes, and English is creating new ones, like the awful awesome, which has had 20 years of a run among younger people, meaning excellent.
Yes.
I think it's starting to wane.
Thank goodness.
I don't know what's going to take its place, but I hope it goes quick.
I was hoping that like as a holder in conversation might be going too, but I'm not sure that's happened yet.
Well, awesome and like we got from America, like so much else. I've got a database of nearly 10,000 Americanisms, and some of them, like okay and Coke, are the most recognized words on the planet. So American English has done a lot. And some of it, like bonnet and boot and hood and trunk, which does your car have? I had a Holden once, and the manufacturer's manual said that it had a hood and a trunk. And I rang them up and said, this is an Australian car. And they said, well, what more do you want? We took the American manual, we've changed left-hand drive to right-hand drive. Anything more of that's a bit of an ask. So I sent two of my students to Toowong Shopping Centre to check what the locals were saying. Younger people were all saying hood and trunk. People said bonnet and boot. And that's the way things are going. A lot of Americanisms are now standard, like French fries, which, by the way, should be Belgian fries. They're not French at all. And all the fast food things like frankfurters and burgers and so on, and a six-pack, all of that's American, and we've just taken it on.
Yeah. Roly, misuses is also always a lot of fun. And one of my favourites to play was always your word for today, or your woofty.
Yes.
Which you blame me for, but I'm blaming you for it. That was your idea, not mine, woofty.
We are the parents. There we go.
Vomitorium.
Yeah, now, Vermo is the Latin word meaning I throw up. And vomito is a version of it, meaning I do it either repeatedly or often. But unfortunately, a vomitorium has nothing to do with throwing up. Now, it is true that the ancient Romans used to binge, particularly in the later years of the empire, and then they'd go and throw up and then go back and have another crack. But a vomitorium is actually a part of the Circus Maximus. It's a great big amphitheatre in Rome, and a vomitorium was a passage where you could get people quickly in and out of the theatre. And there are some theatres in Australia which still have a vomitory, which is a place where people can go quickly to and from the stage without throwing up.
I'm pretty sure they don't market like that though, do they? I'd hate to go to the opera house and find I was in the vomitory.
I think it's actor speak, and they like using it amongst themselves. But no, this is one which gives every indication of being something unprintable, and in fact, it's not at all. Or people get mixed up between sewage and sewerage.
Yep.
Sewage is the stuff that flows down the pipe. Sewerage is the pipes themselves. And so, if you say I'm putting sewerage on my fields, wrong word.
Yes.
I'm putting the content, not the pipes.
One of the other things that we've all noticed, I think, is instead of a ceremony, cemetery, it's now cemetery, ceremony. And I don't think we're getting that back, Roly. I think the horse is well and truly bolted on those.
I'm hanging on to the stable door, but I think it's really a losing battle. During the 2000 Olympics, there was an edict out on the ABC that it was a ceremony, not a ceremony. But NBC was broadcasting from the next booth, and they were saying ceremony. Yeah. And Secretary, Ceremony, Laboratory are all American, and they have become standard among, again, younger folk, as has gotten, which was regarded when I was at school as a terrible, vulgar Americanism, but which is now coming across the Pacific at the rate of knots, and is now the standard way people under about probably 35 will express themselves. Yeah. So as people to say, I have got, we are members of a vanishing generation, and my generation is older than yours.
It's very true. I know that my daughter, I try to get her to say ceremony, and she says, no, not even my English teacher says it like that, Mum. So we're done, Roly. It's a sad truth. What about words like hyperthermia or hyperthermia?
Hyper and hypo. Now, the hyperthermia means too much, and hypo means not enough. So hyperthermia means you're too hot, and hypothermia means you're too cold. Right? Now, when we say them, hypothermia, it's almost impossible to distinguish which we're saying, because it's an unstressed vowel and it just comes out the same. If a doctor wants to make the distinction, they actually say very carefully hyperthermia or hypothermia, and we know. But this is a case where writing is much clearer than speaking. And, you know, if just think about it, that hyper has an E is higher in the alphabet than O, so E is going to be higher than O and is therefore higher in temperature. And that gets us out of the problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are so many of those in the book, Word for Today. It's brilliant. For those who don't know, Roly, how many languages do you speak?
I speak 5, and I read another 15 or so, but some with great help from a dictionary. Apart from English, it's Russian, which I used to teach, Polish, which my wife spoke, so I learned Polish, and French and German. And it gives me great pleasure to be able to cruise around the net and read the news in different languages from different places with different points of view. And I dream in 5 languages with characters talking to each other in different languages. It's quite fun, but occasionally a little mind-bending.
Goodness. Well, isn't that what they say? You know you've mastered a language when you dream in it.
I think so. And I'm hoping that I can fit another language in there with the passage of time, maybe Chinese, but my head is full of words from languages that I learned years ago, and I want to go delete on bits of my memory, and it won't go like that.
How do you think languages shape our experience of our world? That the words that we do and don't have inform us about the world and help us to tell others about ourselves as well?
Oh, this is a huge question, and it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis for people who know about such things. The strong version says the language dictates the way you think about the world. The more moderate version says language doesn't dictate, but it helps to shape it. So, for example, in Russian, there's no word for blue. There are 2 words for blue. There's a light blue, which is goluboy, and there's a deep blue, which is sinyi. So when a Russian person sees blue, they immediately make a split. Now, in Japanese, blue and green have a different boundary from where we are. So the Japanese think of traffic lights as being red and blue rather than red and green. And some languages have really rich vocabularies for certain areas, you know, like types of camels in Berber, which is a language of sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And some languages are extremely good at technology. And other languages resist buying things in from other places. My favorite example is in Icelandic, which is a language which they try and keep very pure. And when the television monitor came in, it was a monitor television, and they decided they were going to call it skjar, which is an amniotic sac of a cow. And they did that because in Iceland, this was the only material they had in olden times, which was transparent and kept the wind out because it's very cold up there. And if you think about the screen on the front of a VDU, it is bent and it lets light through, and they've preserved the purity of the language.
It's like, was it France? You were telling us that they have a body that goes through a language, and if you use a word that there's a better French word for it, you get in trouble.
Worse than that, they take you to court. If you're a journalist in France, there's a thing called the Loi Tuban, the Tuban Law, and they can actually fine you for using an English word where there's a perfectly good French one. And every language in Europe has a language academy which regulates it, except for English. Now, in the 18th century and then the 19th, they did have a bit of a think about, could we have an academy? But then the Americans said, well, we'll have it. And the British said, no, we'll have it. And now English has escaped. There's no way we can get it back. It's the property of the world. And we just have to use the English that we have, our beautiful, lovely, juicy, unpredictable Australian English, and just rejoice in it the way it is.
Well, I'm sure that there are lots of questions that are going to come our way about Word for Today and language in general in your years as a language professor. Jennifer?
Yes.
Has Jennifer frozen for everyone else?
It comes and goes a little bit, I'm afraid. We've got an awful lot of people online, and I think the software is taking a bit of trouble keeping up. But if anyone does have a question, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. This does feel a little bit like a radio broadcast in some ways, Roly, doesn't it?
It is. But at least I can see you, because over the last 5 months since COVID arrived, I've had to do all the programs from home with a microphone and an app on my phone, which gets straight to the ABC studio. The quality is pretty good, but without the face-to-face contact, you don't have quite the same to and fro. You can't have a really good, snappy interaction. And it makes me listen to, in this case, Kat Feeney, whom I'm doing programs with this year, or Peter Gers in Adelaide, listening to their voices very carefully to find out whether they want to move on, whether they want to explore something in a bit more detail, or whether they think I'm just being plain dull.
Sorry, Jennifer.
Are you able to hear me now?
We can.
Okay. Now, Patricia has asked and has said, my sons say verse, whereas I would say verses when they were playing against another team. Is the language evolving?
Indeed. This is interesting because it's a bit of Latin which has gotten misplaced and misunderstood. Versus is a Latin preposition and it means against. So you might say Richmond versus Geelong or whatever, meaning against. But when someone hears that, they don't see it written and they hear versus, they think the S on the end is a verb. So they think so-and-so versus someone else, meaning someone plays someone else. And from that, it's called a back formation, where you create a verb where it never existed before in English. And so we have now a verb to verse. I'm versing the such and such a team on Saturday. We have versed so-and-so 3 times in the last season. And it's become a full-blown version of an English verb, even though it started by a mistake in Latin. But that actually happens a lot. Say quorum is Latin and it means of whom. And it comes from a phrase, quorum praesentia sufficit, of whom the presence is sufficient, meaning you've got enough people for the meeting to go ahead. And quorum is a pronoun, of whom, and we've turned it into a noun. Do you have a quorum? Yep, we can go ahead. We are quorate. So English is like this. It grabs words from elsewhere. We grab the word, for example, éditeur, meaning editor, from French, except that in French it means a publisher, which is what Madonna does. And then we made it into an editor, which in French is rédacteur. And then we think, hang on, it's got an OR on the end. So we'll create the verb to edit, which was never there in French. And so English, if you like, has gobbled up something new, created something which is completely English, bastardized the source, and incorporated it into what is the increasing body of English as we go along.
Thank you, Rolly. Now, Patricia would like to know why we often call police coppers.
That one is unknown, and the dictionaries tend to say orig uncertain, I'm afraid, with a lot of these things. Copper is called an element, but it probably goes back to British slang in the 19th century, and particularly when Sir Robert Peel first set up the police force. They were called peelers. So as far as I'm aware, no one's actually quite worked out what copper is, except that there is a verb to cop, meaning to grab or to take. And so someone who grabs you, taps you on the shoulder and says, nah, here we go, mate, has copped you. And that may be the source for copper.
Right. And I must also apologise, that question came from Jenny, not from Patricia. Now, I have another question from Mandy. Mandy has asked, when you say English is the biggest language, Roly, what do you actually mean? Largest number of words or something else?
Certainly the largest number of words. The Oxford English Dictionary is probably 690,000 words. And if you add all of the technical language, the slang in different parts of the world, people guess that English has well over 1 million words, which is enormously many than even French and German and Spanish. But it's also the biggest language that's ever been in terms of number of speakers. The number of people who are first language speakers of English is about 450 million. And that's when you learn English from your parents. But English is also used by more than any other language around the world for commerce, for tourism, for diplomacy, for culture, for popular songs. Think of the Eurovision Song Contest and how many of the songs on there from non-English speaking countries are sung in English, right? So that English has become the lingua franca. It's the language which we communicate in if we don't have someone who speaks our language. And as a result, it's just become this monster, and we no longer, as I said, have any control over it.
Now, I do also have a couple of comments. One is from Francis, who says, I'm so excited. Roly Sussex has been a hero figure for me for 30 plus years. I started my studies in linguistics at the Uni of New England in 1985. She says, thank you to avid reader. And she says she already has her copy on order. I also have another comment from Diane who says, not a question, but as an 80-year-old, I found this fascinating. I hope that I will not be so judgmental in future. The misused words I hate more than anything is brought and bought.
That's an odd one, because you also hear performance rather than performance. Now, almost all of the comments that people make about mispronunciation in English are simplifications where you leave something out. So Arctic becomes Arctic, and Australia becomes Australia, and vulnerable becomes vulnerable. But in this particular case, we're putting in a sound. And I know we write R in performance, but we don't pronounce it. One of the things about English is we don't pronounce R after vowels, unlike the Americans and most British dialects and Irish and Scottish and so on. So this is an odd one. The other thing I'd like to say about this comment is that English is no longer a single entity. And there is a journal called World Englishes. And in fact, it is. It's many varieties, which is unified by a kind of common core, but with innumerable different varieties in different places. So there's Chinglish in China, which has a Chinese flavor, and there's Japlish in Japan, and Manglish in Malaysia, and Singlish in Singapore, and so on. And English in each place has adapted some of the features from the local language or the way people use English there. And although people often are able to speak more or less standard English, or world standard English, or international English, they also have a local variety which is now being used, say in China, for education, for commerce, all sorts of things where the Chinese are moving into becoming a bilingual nation. And in fact, in China in year 12, everybody does Chinese and English and mathematics.
That leads me nicely actually into a question from Michelle, who asks, do you feel that you have a slightly different personality when you're speaking another language?
But of course, when I speak French, I have a different movement of the eyebrows. I become mobile. I cannot stop it. I'm quite serious. You know, if you really learn a language well, you learn different intonation, you learn to be expressive in different ways, and you find that your body goes along with the grammar and the words and the pronunciation and things. And so that I am actually quite a different person when speaking different languages. And sometimes when you're learning a new language, you can have beautiful grammar, beautiful pronunciation, beautiful vocabulary, and you still sound like an English speaker trying to do language X. Mm. When you really get inside a language, you start behaving like it. And then, you know, if you come back home after being overseas for a while, they say, what's happened to you? You've got all sort of wavy and things. You know? Body language is a very important part of language competence.
Jennifer, sorry to interrupt. Roly, one of the sort of most fun segments we've ever done was on how people describe the sounds their pets make. So woof in Australia, you know, my dog barks, woof woof, is very different to how they might say it in a different country. And I think that was some of the best fun we ever had, was you doing those impressions.
That's right. Well, a dog in Chinese goes wong wong. You know, and in French it goes wah wah. And you'd think that surely a dog makes the same sort of noise, but it's been heard differently in different places. So a rooster goes cock-a-doodle-doo in English, and it goes cucuricou in French and kikiriki in German. And I once asked one of my Arabic students what sound a rooster makes in Arabic, and he said, eek. And he said, eek. So he was pulling my leg, and I was duly corrected. Now, the interesting thing is that, you know, people hear different things in different languages. And even when the stimulus from a dog is going to be pretty well standard, it comes out in that language's representation in different ways. And I really do feel that when I talk another language, I may be trying to make similar messages, but the way they come out can be different. And sometimes when I'm tired, I can feel a message, composing it myself in my head in Polish, and it wants to come out in French, and it gets mangled on the way out.
There's an interesting question here from Dr. Janet Lee, who says, in light of the comment regarding not being able to see the person when you're speaking or being interviewed, how do you think modern communication via Zooming and texting will evolve language and communication? It is more than just not having access to nonverbals, which are kind of made up for the emojis. Are emojis words, a new language?
Well, one of the emojis, the laughing, crying one, was actually the word of the year from, I think, the Oxford Dictionary in something like 2015. And that means that the emoji is actually graduated, you know, with one of the most august sources on the planet to being equivalent to a word. Now, emojis are there, I think, to provide the things which writing is not good at doing, which is emotion, facial expression, overtoned, because, you know, face to face, you can say so much more than you can in writing. You know, we think of writing as being, in a sense, superior. Well, it actually contains a lot less information. So emojis are there to fill in a gap, and sometimes you can do a smiley face, which means what I'm about to say may cause you a bit of grief, but I don't mean it badly. Now, that's a rather nice way of using the technology, and emojis are a Japanese invention, by the way, to try and enrich the way you're communicating. Now, in the early days of SMSs and so on, there was a limit of 140 characters. So you had to be clever at being brief. And younger people were very clever at being very brief and inventing new ways of abbreviating words. Now, not just the letter U for YOU and GR and the number 8 for great and so on, but it went right across the board. And I've had a look at SMSs in different languages, and the same thing happens everywhere. Young people are the ones who are driving it, and they're making it creative and different and new. What is important is that you know that there is a barrier between that sort of language and the sort of language you would write for formal purposes. That's really important, because if you cross that barrier, then you can start appearing less competent than you really are. And so when we actually learn English, we are learning, I suppose, multiple languages, or at least multiple codes of English, and we are expected to be competent in all of them.
Indeed. Roly, Elaine has asked, where did the saying, "What did your last slave die of," come from?
What did your last?
Slave die of.
What did your last slave die of? I usually say answering back.
Yeah, this is the automatic performance of phones. I think doing things. It's like pocket dialing and so on. When you've sent dialed someone and you didn't mean to. But again, this has happened from mouse onwards. Now, mouse was invented by an American called Douglas Engelbart, and technology has been providing new challenges, new ways of getting things wrong. Look what predictive text does to some of the things we want to send. Enormously embarrassing. So, these are ways in which the technology, particularly if we're using it fast, can lead us into temptation and sometimes into things we wouldn't otherwise want to say at all.
Yeah. Siren has asked if you have any comments on the use of author as a verb.
Mm-hmm.
So-and-so has authored several books. Is that different from writing a book?
I don't think so, except that it's a fairly recent, it's recently become very common, but the process of turning a noun into a verb or a verb into a noun without putting anything on the end is called conversion. And it's been going in English since well before Shakespeare, who died in 1616. I think one of his plays, the Scottish play that we're not meant to name, he said, "Uncle me no uncles." In other words, don't go on about uncles to me. And so, you oil your bicycle, you butter your bread, and you can, I'm a cyclist, and someone can door you, which means they open the door and you ride your bike into the open door. So that nouns become verbs and verbs become nouns very frequently in English. And it's become a major way in which the language has expanded. I don't like some of these things. We've had examples of, I think, very ugly conversion. But if you think about AFL, the talls are players who are tall, ruckman, and this is now standard part of the vocabulary of the sport.
I've always had a little trouble with the new usage of the word impact. Is that one that bothers you?
Sorry, which word?
The word impact.
Ah, yes. It used to be a noun, but now it's a verb. And then at first when it was a verb, you impacted on something. Right? Now it's a transitive verb. It doesn't take on at all. And that's a bit like battle. You used to battle against a fire. You now battle a fire. And also in cricket, you used to defend yourself against a rising ball. You now defend a rising ball. And the first time I heard that, I thought, we're in court and we've got a lawyer there and the ball has done something bad. What English has done is it's broken its own rules to create a new way of talking about things. And so, this is part of the ongoing rush of English. There's a really grey area between what is a new innovation, one which is still a little bit too fresh to be commonly used. But then if people whom we respect use these, then they quite quickly get into the regular part of English. They'll find a way into the dictionary. The Macquarie Dictionary, for example, decided that agreeance should be included in their edition about 12 years ago. Now, it should be agreement historically, but a lot of people say agreeance. And so they said, look, this is now a part of the language. It may not be the preferred form, but we must list it because it is so widely used.
Do you have, Wendy has asked Roly if you have a pet peeve. She says, mine is alternative versus alternate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, alter in Latin means the other of two. And if you alternate, you're meant to go from A to B or back to A again. Alternative now is taken to mean just another choice. And so you could have, there are 73 alternatives, whereas a speaker of Latin would have regarded that as being absolutely wrong. So that is one which I don't particularly like. I don't like gotten because I grew up with the feeling that this was something that is not my English. And so there are lots of things which I've got sort of second thoughts about. I don't really like mandatory. I don't even like the word cool because I'm too old for that. It's not part of my vocabulary. I recognize it. I know what it means. I honor the right of other people to say it, but I also draw a line in the sand and refuse to utter it myself, unless I'm going to have a cool beer at the end of a day.
Lovely. We're coming up to the end of this wonderful event. It's been so wonderful hearing all of your insights and the repartee between you and Kelly. At this point, Kelly and Roly, do you have any final words you would like to say?
Can I go first?
Sure.
I'd like to thank Avid, first of all, for doing this, because you do marvelous book launches, and I've been present at one of them, and they are terrific events. Using Zoom like this in a creative way to include lots of people in a conversation, it seems to me a brilliant adaptation of technology to a very important function. And also thanks to UQP and to Madonna and my editor Felicity and Sally, who's been taking care of the publicity. They've been marvelous to work with. And if you're going to do a book and you want someone who's going to hold your hand firmly but decisively, I've learned an awful lot from them. So thank you. And thanks to Kelly, who actually was the co-parent of the Woofties and who has been a marvelous person from whom I've learned a lot of radio as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Roly just said about avid reader. Thank you so much. And UQ Press, which of course I have a lot of dealings with, talking with authors all of the time. So I know they do a brilliant professional job. And Roly is exactly in life as you hear him on the radio. He's a thorough gentleman. He is so much fun. And he not only, though, can share with you the information he has. A thing I've really loved about working with you was that the look in your eyes when somebody uses a word or phrase you haven't heard before, that curiosity, that, oh, what does that mean? That excitement about language has never, ever waned. And I was producing other people. You probably don't remember when we first met.
I do.
So that's how long, I've been watching you and listening to you. And you were just as excited about language then as you are now. So, and I find that, well, I hate the word inspirational because everything's inspirational, but it says to me that, you can find joy in something you love forever if you want to.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Thank you so much, Roly. And thank you, Madonna, and everyone for joining us tonight. I do want to just mention again that we do have Roly's book, Word for Today, at Avid. It is, and if you use that code that I gave you earlier, event, you will get 10% off. I'd also...
What we do now?
And I would also mention, I believe Roly is going to try to come into the bookshop on Friday to sign some copies as well. So hopefully we'll have some signed copies by the weekend. So look out for those. And thank you all again so much for coming. I will invite you.
It was actually a professor.
Thank you, Roly and Kelly and Donna for this lovely event this evening. And it's just wonderful to have you all with us. I'd like to join me in thanking Roly.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Very entertaining. Yeah. Merci.
Night, everyone.
Bonne nuit.
Night, everybody, and thank you.
Right, Roly.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Yeah.
All right.